amazing. And I just wanted to give her credit because she's just an incredible partner.
All right, so Sherry wrote this before and pulled from a couple of other autobiographical works, and I'm going to read it. And it's about 15 to 18 minutes. The door of the mental hospital locks noisily behind me, and I realise that already I've succumbed. You know that you need to be here. You are ill, and we're here to help. Actually, I'm going to stand up because I can't see everybody. It's been 5 minutes, and already I am a mental patient. Up to this point, I've understood my experience as a normal reaction to abnormal events. But that understanding is now shattered with the realization that I am ill and science is on their side. I have learned that others can assign fault, that somehow it always seems to be mine, and that pain is controlled by the person who has the power. It doesn't hurt that much. Their cumulative messages become truth, and truth becomes my skin, while otherness becomes my identity. I'm a teenager, and the shame is starting to leak out. Up until now, I've squeaked by rather unnoticed, but adolescents are compelled to act on feelings. I am convinced that I can fly, and believe me, I do try. Night after night, I don't sleep. I start to see things that others don't, and I begin to shake and stutter. My communication becomes more and more obtuse, until my mother finds me one snowy day walking barefoot around in circles, muttering to myself. My mother is afraid and doesn't know whether to be mad or ignore me, but finally reacts and does the inconceivable. She calls a psychiatrist. No one in our family has ever even seen a psychiatrist. People should learn to pull themselves up by their bootstraps and to get on with their lives. I quickly learn the doctor's story. All that I have been experiencing is part of the illness. These kinds of things will probably keep happening, but with medication and occasional hospitalization, it can be managed. At home, I belong to a band. I'm a musician, and it is the one thing in my life that makes me feel whole and real. This takes care of the feeling side of things, but I still struggle with my thoughts, trying to understand my own experience. It is my head that won't change. I go on to college, and I find that there are others like me who also struggle to comprehend what their feelings and experiences really mean. Just lost my place. We are all curious about reality. I study phenomenology, trying to get to the essence of things. Is there a truth, or is it all relative and constructed? I'm curious about how meaning gets made, how things get defined to be one way or the other. I have some great conversations, but the inside, I still know that I'm bad, that I'm crazy, that I'm different. I decide that the only language with any credibility for me is music. For years, this back and forth between head and heart served me well until I'm going through a divorce. Single parenting, 3 small children, working part-time at the local boarding school, and quickly going broke. Although I am teaching music, I know that I am a fake because my music school experience was too short. But I love the energy of the teenagers and so want them to keep them from learning to think that their intensity and their ideas are crazy. One summer, one of the band members is killed in a car crash. The school wants to hire a grief counsellor so that the other kids can get help. I pull them all together and we talk. We decide to spend the summer writing a piece of music for our young friend to perform, for us to perform at the beginning of the next school year. Over that summer, the music that we play not only speaks our grief, but it binds us together in a way that transforms much of the pain. The summer is over, the kids graduate, and I know that I've got to do something else. I decide that maybe social work school is a place where I could learn to work with teenagers using music as a medium. School is hard. I like the headiness of it, but the walls that for so long contained the messages of shame in me begin to leak once again. Desperately trying to stay in school, I vow that I will never end up hospitalised again. But I am doing things that scare people. I can't slow down, I can't sleep, and I feel like I'm doing school while I'm also running with a ball and chain. There is one person who keeps saying, it doesn't have to be like this, but I am totally out of control. There are no options but hospitalisation, and I am terrified. I will not see myself as ill. I am a scholar, I am a musician, but the door locks and I am there again. I no longer have to take responsibility for myself. That is good, because the responsibility of parenting 3 kids with no support and too little money has been grueling, and I am tired. But then they suggest I go on disability, perhaps give up custody of my children. I am far too ill to care for them, they think they know. Right then, there is a little spark of anger. Who are these people, I think? But also, as soon as it flares, the spark expires. I am too worn down to fight them. It has been too long of a haul. They are too clear that they know what they know, and that nothing that I know about me matters. Soon, I am just doing what they say, and it appears to work. For a while, I go back to my life and I cope, and then it happens again. Back in the hospital. This time, something happens that revives my anger. My lawyer calls and says my ex-husband is demanding custody of the children. Doesn't want to pay child support. The nurses, however, say that I can't worry about that now. I need to be here. Another patient sits with me through the hysteria and, when I can listen, says that she too was told she would lose her children. She is angry and challenges me to think about what's important. My love for my kids, the connection we have, and the emotionally abusive life they will have with him. This is the beginning of dissonance. Not a lot, a little, but still something. Something she is saying makes sense to me, even though she, like me, is a patient. Something they are saying does not, even though they are doctors and so-called experts. And the distance between what they are saying and what she is saying is the beginning of my seeing things differently. Time passes. In between hospitalizations, I'm in and out of school, and I go through this for several more years until I realize that most of my conversations are about mental illness, and my friends are all mental patients. We believe that we are sick, and all we can do, really, is to commiserate. I learned to live the life of a mental patient. There comes a time when I'm interning for a school at a domestic violence program. A woman comes to see me. She's been told she's a courageous survivor by other workers, but she's probably needs some counselling. She gets sent to a community mental health program. The next day she comes to me and says that she has a serious mental illness. She no longer sees herself as a survivor, but as sick. What happened here? Why the sudden shift in explanation? Yesterday we were talking about what happened to her. We both knew the problem was abuse in the world. Today, she's talking about what's wrong with her. This troubles me. Over the next months, as we talk, I gradually get the courage to bring it up. How did she go from talking about what had happened to her to talking about what is wrong with her? This time I make it. I get out, continue on, don't lose my kids, continue to discover that there are other ways to understand what happens to me than through the lens of illness. I am lucky. I make a few more friends who help to reinforce this message. And then I start making calls. I find that there is interest at the state level in developing what are called peer support programs. I talk to the director of what's called the Office of Consumer Affairs and tell him about my experience with the women at the DV Centre. I tell him how their abuse stories got lost, how they go into a mental health agency to get help with their experience of being abused and come out instead with a diagnosis of mental illness and a bag full of medication. I tell him how this leads to more and more psychiatric involvement and less community involvement. I confide in him my conviction that services are turning survivors into patients. What, I ask him, are the resources for people who have got stuck in this situation? To my surprise, he tells me there is some seed money available for peer support. He explains that peer support is support provided by people who have been consumers of mental health services, who want to support others in a similar situation, a bit like 12-step programs. He hopes that there will be enough interest to start a program that would provide an alternative to traditional services. I tell him that this sounds amazing, and it's not long before I take the job as director of this project. I have two missions. One, to keep people out of psychiatric hospitals, and two, to continue to work with women who have experienced past violence to keep them from seeing their experience as illness. I go and have dinner with the members and try to find out if they are interested in developing a new program. It takes a while to wade through the medication haze, clouding out most semblance of their motivation. Nevertheless, there are a few people who say they would like to help. I feel good about this, hopeful. We might really go somewhere. This could lead to real change. Then I ask the group what they envisage, and I get my next eye-opener. I'm expecting them to say, we want to work together for better housing, education, jobs, respect, an end to discrimination, to stop being treated like children. Instead, I get responses like, I want you to take us to the beach. I want you to cook for us. I want. I am taken aback. How did we get like this? Again, my mind returns to our stories. First to my story, then to the story that my logic and my intuition together imagine them to have based on my story. How does this dependency make sense? Where did it come from? Where do we go from here? It is at that point that we start to have very different conversations. The questions become less cautious, more daring, even seemingly outrageous. What if we can move on with our lives? Do something other than be mental patients. Start our own support network. Replace the whole hospital system. It's not long before we turn to each other rather than calling emergency services when we're feeling frightened or really down. It's much nicer being listened to by a friend rather than being asked about our safety. As our confidence builds, we even decide to start our own alternative to psychiatric hospitalisation. Quite a shift in the status quo. Patients running the asylum. In our crisis alternative program, people can come in when they're worried they might get hospitalised. And instead of assessing each other, we simply talk. Unafraid that we'll be hospitalised, we're freer to talk about things like suicidal feelings and find that most of us have felt that way at one time or another. We start new groups, try new approaches as old stories are re-examined and new stories are tried out. As we continue to play with new assumptions and beliefs, we are writing ourselves into a new reality. We are creating community and we are challenging the secrecy of what has conversations that lead to new behaviour. This isn't rocket science, but it's certainly different from what we've been told to expect. Which, happily, as we are learning to get new results through challenging old assumptions, is both the process and the product of our efforts. And so I wonder what your stories are. When did you learn to be a mental patient? When and with whom do you tell different stories? It's an important discussion. And what are some of the things that get in the way of doing something differently? How will you know? What are the things telling you you're going in possibly the wrong direction? The first thing you may notice is that you're dying to help. Now, help is not necessarily a bad thing at all, but when you are out for your own satisfaction, help can quite quickly turn into control. Remember the times when you've heard people say things like, I'm only doing this for your own good. Is that necessarily true, or did they do it so that they wouldn't have to feel so uncomfortable watching while you did things your way, however painful it might have been? Help can become a double-edged sword if it's used to be coercive, controlling, is fear-based, or is done to make the helper feel better about having done something. And so we talk about learning Learning together versus helping. This is the second principle of intentional peer support. First one is shifting from helping to learning and growing together. Let's talk about this for a minute. What's different about learning rather than helping? Learning implies a curiosity, an inquisitiveness about the other, their way of knowing, their way of making sense of the world, whereas helping often implies that you already have the answers, that you know better, that you can come in and tell someone what to do, and if they do it, everything will work out the way it did for you when you were in their shoes. Well, maybe and maybe not, but one thing is for certain, helping based on what's worked for you can also be tremendously damaging. The next principle to remember is to focus on the relationship rather than on the individual. As in help, when we pay attention exclusively to the individual, we can easily fall into the kind of help we talked about before, where all my time and focus goes into you and what you need rather than into our process of relating. When I pay attention to what's going on between us, it opens up a line of communication that supports honesty, safety, and integrity, and ultimately changes the very direction I had wanted to go with you. In other words, when I was paying attention to you and your changes, nothing that I did factored into it. But when I put myself into it, I realized that yours and my interaction was just that, and it might go anywhere. There is no predictability, rather a randomness, which is exactly what we are striving for in peer support, not the linear outcomes and goals we've come to think of as success. Finally, the third thing, and perhaps the hardest to remember, is not to react out of fear, but to try out new ways of relating based on hope and possibility. This is easier said than done. When we're afraid, we just want to go back to the way they were before, to become stable. And yet, stability may not be the goal. Think of a time when things felt really out of control for you. Yet you had a sense of what you needed and wanted, even if others around you said they knew better. Chances are things happened that were out of your control, perhaps even slowing your process. This may have led you into dependence on someone else's experience. In other words, you may have become reliant on someone else's interpretation of your experience. This happens simply when someone says to you, "That doesn't hurt," or "Don't cry over spilt milk," and you wonder why you're making a big deal out of something that others don't think is a big deal. Or the opposite, when what you're doing doesn't affect you at all, and someone else is scared that you're going to get hurt, and they continuously say, "Be careful." Pretty soon you're terrified of something bad happening and you're reacting to their fear. This leads to complicated dynamics where one person's emotions drive the reaction of the other person. This is too often what happens in mental health services when they tell us that we are helpless. We have learned to be that way because are based on their fear. And so today I put out a bit of a warning that it's quite easy to do what's being done to us. And for all the right reasons, we just want to help. We care about the other person and we are afraid for them. Or really, are we afraid for ourselves? What might be the consequences of this person's actions? Will we be seen to have failed them? The dynamics are complicated when one person's emotions drive the reaction of the other person. This is too often what happens in mental health services where they tell us we are helpless. We have learned to be that way based on their fear. And so we go on into doing peer support with a focus on learning rather than helping, with an attention to the relationship rather than on the individual, and onto creating opportunities for hope and possibility rather than fear and power and control. Or at least we try. And although it sounds like a lot of hard work, and it is, it's also fun, rewarding, simply about having good relationships that promote health and well-being in all of our relationships. Thank you.